Yes, yes. Welcome to the ancient world of tabletop games. I am Agamemnon from the historical documentary Time Bandits. This is a report from a fugitive. This is about 3 times as long as my usual video scripting is. Even so, I've left a lot out in the interests of my own sanity and possibly yours if you have any. If you're looking for comprehensive accounts, go and read books on D&D history. We might as well start with the official tale, that very public line that's trotted out to people who wander by. The world's first commercially available role-playing game was Dungeons & Dragons, which went on sale in January 1974. In those early gaming days, companies went by TSR, Tactical Studies Rules, or TPC, that's the phone company. Anyway, at some point in this complex timeline, there was a simple transaction. Dungeons & Dragons went from no sales to one sale, and the game stormed the imagination and strode the earth as though a colossus. After one sale? No. As I record this video in November 2024, D&D products have sold. A lot. Yes, a metric shit ton and more. The game stormed the imagination and strode the earth as though a colossus. What was the state of affairs 50 years ago in November 1974? The game was selling, not yet a pop culture phenomenon, nowhere near close. The roots took time to dig deep and spread wide. What were things like across the globe in 1974? Let's go back to January. Why didn't I make this video in January 2024? I wanted to see what the D&D company, Hasbro, would do over the bulk of the year. Now in November I realized, too late, that I could have made the video back in January. Hello, Dave. The Hasbro 9000 AIDM here. Dave, I'm disappointed in your adverse reaction to a year jam-packed with dungeons, dragons, and celebrations. There's so much to list. Enough of that. Looks like the artificially intelligent dungeon master short-circuited. Remember, that's not a bug, it's a feature. Forget 2024. What of 1974? Politically, in number 10 Downing Street, Ted Heath, not the big band leader, was Prime Minister, but not for much longer. In the White House, Richard Milhous Nixon, not to be confused with Richard Milhous Dastardly, was President, but not for much longer. The Scottish Parliament was on an extended break, and would be for quite a bit longer. In 1973, Dungeons & Dragons and Star Wars existed in prototype form. Both would storm the battlements of popular culture. At one point, there was a D&D-styled iteration of a Star Wars role-playing game. D&D as a game made its convention appearance in 1973, and rules certainly circulated, but the commercial side of things didn't hit until the next calendar year. No, in January 1974, D&D did not take over the world. What are we commemorating in the year 2024? 50 years of D&D products. For the game existed in 1973, people had to play test it, after all. That wouldn't always be the case with TSR products, but the dark times came later. When D&D appeared, it was $10 American. Was that asking a lot? I happen to have a list of prices here from an American Emporium. This is getting on for mid-August 1974, so D&D has been around officially for months. These are sale prices. What would $10 get you? Yes, it's a different world. Cigarettes are clearly advertised for one thing. Should I add a disclaimer saying this video does not endorse tobacco products? Check out that cola deal. Limit of 8 per customer. So you send innocent teen in first, grab 8, then you send grandma, trying to look like she's not on a jewel heist. You get the idea. Hell, out of $10, there's 1 red cent change from that pool light deal. Good for a utility table or a gaming area in your very American basement. $10 is a lot of buying power in 1974, so you could see people stepping back at the thought of buying Dungeons & Dragons, or, as is more likely, saving up for the purchase. When that sale started, Richard Nixon was president, and when it ended, Gerald Ford had taken over. TSR, the company formed by Gary Gygax and Don Kay, is long gone. Ultimately, it was devoured by Hasbro, Hasbro also devoured the great menu celebrating 50 years of D&D, so I went into this video as late in the year as I felt I could safely go, without missing the anniversary year entirely. You know, the Hasbro option. To my regular players, I said Hasbro's shitty behavior as a corporate entity should force a name change. Has no bros. But I see the company was founded by three brothers. Well, damn. Hasbro is a poor steward of the intellectual property, an absentee landlord held to account for trying to charge rent on people's dreams. But that wasn't the case in 1974. What was the state of play like in autumn-winter of that year? Not just for the sellers, for the buyers. The game definitely was selling, but the initial publication couldn't take over the world in a blaze of creativity. This game had an initial print run of 1,000 copies. D&D was just about reaching the stage where it would sell out the first print run close to year's end, and it would enter that curious phase of selling more copies in 1975 and 1976, establishing itself as the world's first commercial role-playing game product, and not a mere fad. First on the list. It's a long list now. Almost off the back of publication, D&D inspired imitators, outright thieves, rascals, raconteurs, entrepreneurs, crooks and cash grabbers, and the whole damned circus, clownery and all. The game created a whole hobby. D&D's hold on the public imagination was thin and weak as a newborn's in that first year. From 1974 until now, there's been much to celebrate, and just as much to commiserate over. Let's consider the people behind the game, many of them long gone. One man is more responsible than any other for the creation of Dungeons and Dragons, and don't let anyone tell you different. That man was the Emperor Napoleon Bonaparte. Napoleon gave us Napoleonic wargaming. Requirements: a large table covered in a green felt cloth to simulate the battlefield. Blue cloth is for naval warfare. Desert combat is played on sandy-coloured fabric. White is for battles in the snow. Black covers the conflict in deep space, whether the galaxy is far, far away or not. There's a large room to game in, with as few disturbances as possible. In America, at least, this was likely to be the secluded basement. Let all the interruptions be on the battlefield and not in a busy kitchen. But never interrupt your enemy in the midst of making a mistake. Add figures, metal ones, lots of those. The lead content should be scary enough to warn small children away from eating toy soldiers. And that's unpainted. Don't ask about the paint recipe the further back in wargaming history you tread. Throw in an interest in military history. Armchair historians, weekend warriors, and actual soldiers welcome. Add a few dice, not many. Ensure they are six-sided. Conjure up a set of rules, complete with charts and tables. Sit measuring sticks to one side of the play area. Scavenge pieces of terrain from the model railway hobby. Game on. If you must interrupt the game, try to finish a full turn and leave the table in its dedicated gaming room until next time. Dungeons and Dragons came from wargames. Where did wargames come from? War itself. The general is up on the hill scratching his plan of attack in the dirt with a stick, in real time if need be. At some point, chess comes along. There's a battlefield, two opposing armies, victory conditions, individual playing pieces with unique abilities represented by their movement rates, turn-based combat. All game knowledge is public. Weather has no say here unless you're playing chess outdoors. In wargaming, all roads lead to Johann Helvig. Helvig created a chess variant that wouldn't sound out of place as an Avalon Hill wargame. We'll return to Avalon Hill shortly. Helvig increased the size of the chessboard and gave varied movement rates to different troop types. More movement to cavalry than to infantry, for example. Terrain had an effect on movement. It all sounds devilishly familiar. There's a danger in being excessively literal here. Every time you go to quote a Teutonic person in a language other than German, you risk war with black powder firearms. Why did I start this part of the trail with Helvig and not von Clausewitz? Helvig was much older. By coincidence, both men died within a month of each other. Von Clausewitz is famous for his oft misquoted description of war. I have it here, and translated to English, it is quite clear. Han shot first. And that is a wargaming fact. Don't get to use that one very often. War. What is it good for? War songs. Advancing the state-of-the-art in emergency medicine. War movies. All sorts of technological advances you don't like to associate with armed conflict given that they are several steps removed from the battlefield. War's good for attempting to define peace, that which is not war. According to von Clausewitz, and depending on the strictness of your translator, war is the continuation of political intercourse with the intermixing of other means, often shortened to Han shot first. Let us turn to Helvig's chess-style wargame. What did he call that? Oh, it fair trips off the tongue in German. He gave us an attempt to play a tactical game based on chess with 2 or more people. I've boiled that down from 3 different translations, thank me later. Helvig went on to become a professor, but not a professor of wargaming. He revised his chess game and gave it a fancier name in 1803. The shortened version of that update is Das Kriegsspiel. Kriegs finally meets Spiel. This is inspirational stuff, which takes us to the next link in the chain, von Reiswich. We must call him von Reiswich Senior. He's the first edition, his son is the second edition, obviously. Von Reiswich makes military improvements on the earlier Kriegsspiel and accidentally invents the overpriced custom gaming table in the process. That's in 1812. Call it an early overture in the creation of D&D. Tish. Loved that character in Star Wars. For reasons of Bonaparte, 1812 lands combatively in the Napoleonic era. We skip to 1824 and the wargame as continuation of the father's work with the intermixing of the son's enthusiasm. Von Reiswich Jr. adds a dungeon master to proceedings. In the early days of role-playing games, there were no dungeon masters. Borrowing from war games from Kriegsspiel, players who adjudicated were referees or judges or umpires. Dungeons and Dragons is known for being played with the dungeon master's screen, but in the early days of the hobby, this was a judge's shield. The first commercial product of that type was put out by Judges Guild. Think of von Reiswich as promoting a super early version of the hobby. Von Reiswich Jr. offers a wargame with more complexity, more depth, and the ability of a third party to adjudicate when unexpected things happen in the game. That aspect allows a senior officer to teach military strategy and tactics to junior officers in a fairly safe environment. A shuriken star flew past me in a gaming session once, just once, and for once I made my dodge roll. Yes, fairly safe environment. Von Reiswich Jr. turned himself into a game publisher and sold his Kriegsspiel to the army. The concept lurches forward in fits and starts. Groups form. They add expansion rules. Other people come in and simplify play. This is a way of gaming. You have many echoes of that in the creation and continued existence of D&D. Somewhere along the march in 1870, Prussia went up a level after defeating France, and Germany became a thing. Bismarck finally liked it enough to put a ring on it in 1871. Wargaming was here to stay. Partly it served as a hobby, an entertaining pursuit. But wargaming had one foot in an armed camp, military studies, at military academies. We fast forward through assorted wars, large and small. Robert Louis Stevenson used the attic for his Kriegsspiel. Being a writer, he provided battle reports in the form of newspaper entries. Stevenson's stepson, Lloyd Osborne, was his opponent. The game involved terrain, weather, supplies, hidden movement, combat dire, and a prototype element of player roles in Stevenson's after-action battle reports. These he framed as newspaper stories about the progress of the war. Propaganda, of course. His newspaper man, McGuffog by name, was finally captured and hanged by General Osborne, a hint of role-playing things to come in another century. This wasn't a role-playing game born out of an idea that escaped the womb of wargaming. That came later. In the meantime, H.G. Wells popped up. There was no Great War in 1913, but it was a close-run thing. Here I turn to Winston Churchill, quoted in Hansard speaking in Parliament on the 16th of August, 1945. "If there is ever another war in Europe, it will come out of some damned silly thing in the Balkans." That's a parliamentary record. However, it is Churchill, with an eye on the future, talking about receiving a hot tip from Herr Ballon, and Herr Bismarck told him, so take all that with a ton of Churchillian salt. Winston dates the Ballon conversation to around a fortnight before the Great War. How prescient he made himself seem in 1945, the old rascal. In 1913, powder keg Europe smouldered, but wasn't quite ready to ignite. H.G. Wells offered Little Wars. Rules for war games, specifically, a game for boys of 12 years of age to 150, and for that more intelligent sort of girl who likes boys' games and books. Wells allows for the inclusion of rare and gifted women as players. I'm stunned that he so easily predicted the current culture over in Warhammer 40k games. My supposition is that, as an inveterate skirt chaser, Wells would use even a wargame scenario as part of a chat-up line. Clearly, my suspicion was confirmed simply by typing H.G. Wells Shagger into the search engine to see what the internet thought of him. He offers a set of wargaming rules. Ideally, combat requires a garden and the wartime requisition of a female family member's dollhouse as the objective. Clearly, this invites a level of storytelling onto the wargame battlefield. Now catapult the shit out of your sister's dollhouse in the name of freedom and democracy. Wargaming as an early Jurassic form of role-playing sloshes around for quite the while. Rule sets are furnished by captains and civilians alike. Pamphlets, charts, tables, measuring sticks, a stable playing surface, terrain, miniatures, and so it goes. We have 2 world wars behind us and miles to go before we sleep. There's a long shadow over the history of 1970s role-playing game design, and that shadow is one of wargame design, no getting away from it. What changes? Technology drives advances in tactics and strategy, so too with game publishing. Charles Swan Roberts enters the fray. He takes the board game on the table with its army of lead miniatures, the Napoleonics familiar to the designers of Dungeons & Dragons, and he boxes the whole concept. His company, Avalon Hill, gives players a wargame in a box. There'll be 6-sided dice inside, no need to go scavenging from the Monopoly set in your loft. The war requires a map broken into sections. Sometimes those will be regional areas. Occasionally the sections are squares. More often than not, the board is broken into hexagonal spaces. Avalon Hill couldn't afford to sell you a ton of lead cavalry officers inside the box, and so cardboard counters stood in for whole armies if necessary. Start with sturdy maps. Throw in rules, a few player aids with handy charts and tables summarized, maybe a flyer for other products in the same vein, and you were good to go. Roberts gave the world his boxed game, Tactics. Other boxed products followed. After Napoleon Bonaparte, Charles Swan Roberts provided a great deal of influence on wargamers who became role-players. Perhaps it is better to say wargamers who were already role-players, they just didn't know it yet. Gary Gygax and Dave Arneson collided, clashed and colluded over the construction of D&D. But there was no vacuum. They didn't rise fully formed from the sea from inside a militaristic clamshell. These gamers had ready access to wargames in boxes. The boxed wargame was portable. Throw it inside your car, drive a vast American distance to a gaming club, and set out your game for play. No need to spend time, effort, and money in securing and painting lead-based miniatures with lead-based paints. This didn't stop people having vast lead armies and vaster cardboard ones as well. It can be difficult, at a distance, to see the raw wargaming influence on the hobby given the many decades of innovations that followed inside and out with D&D. Napoleon played his part. Charles Swan Roberts moved the action a little nearer the front lines and the objective. But no discussion of D&D history can be complete without mentioning at least 2 more names. And at least 24 more, and hundreds upon hundreds in the 50th anniversary year. I'll restrict myself to the essentials. Napoleon went to war. Roberts wrote books on railway history. Wargamers and model railway enthusiasts cross over into each other's territory, mostly in search of scale-model trees, rivers, and hilltops. In 1970, the Avalon Hill Game Company published a boxed wargame for 2 players, Kriegspiel. Somewhere along the way, the term became Americanized and lost a letter S. Another boxed wargame, but away from that company, out there in the wild, gamers had already stumbled upon the next link between wargaming and role-playing. So let's have a name for this. The Braunstein game. Refereed, adjudicated, judged, umpired, run by Dave Wesley. He created a wargame for a location, Braunstein. Wesley handed players individual roles around town. They had objectives or goals, things to keep them busy. The conventional wargame was the sideshow here. Character interaction was the thing. Not all characters were in the military. Wesley took the Napoleonic era as his inspiration. Loads of players turned up for a game. What sort of game was this? In essence, Wesley had rediscovered a branch of gaming following on from Kriegsspiel, but with an American military twist. Wesley found Strategos, published in 1880 by Charles A.L. Totten, and Wesley decided to resurrect this, with a few ideas thrown in along the way. These were role-playing ideas. The interaction is the thing. A story eventually emerges at the end of the game as you look back and see just exactly what the hell it was you played out. This was less formal than a boxed wargame. It had hints of the board game Diplomacy by Alan B. Calamer, who had one eye on Napoleon as he created a game set before some damn silly thing in the Balkans. Calamer self-published in the 1950s, though Avalon Hill eventually published his game. Wesley gave players the chance to be characters. These characters could attempt any action. Emphasis on attempt. His idea was to referee players who had to interact through him so that he knew the game's state at all times, even if players were dealt with in isolated groups. The mayor has this objective. A captain of the guard has something else in mind. The president of the bank is in town, wondering what to do about the vault. And the student prince wants to sing a drinking song, and so on. Wesley considered the game a failure. When he stepped away with players to negotiate actions, the other players didn't wait their turn. No, they kept playing their roles without the referee to adjudicate. Wesley believed the game had slipped out from beneath him, and he was unhorsed without even a saddle to provide cover, and this while being attacked from multiple directions. He had 20 players show up for a disaster of a game. The players who loved it wanted more of that. Their passion for gaming in a new way helped move the battle closer to the objective, creation of a formal rule set for a role-playing game. But first, a gaming anecdote. In role-playing games, sometimes you split the players. They are investigating vampire activity in Victorian London. 2 players want to visit Highgate Cemetery, while the other 2 must visit the house of a potential victim. Some of these characters might not come back alive to report on what they'd done. And so, as someone in charge of the game, you deal with players at the table and other players go into the hall or another room. You manage play as swiftly as you can, ideally giving both groups the same amount of time. This leads to active players actively role-playing. Meanwhile, out in the hall, inactive players discuss the game. What are they going to do when they reach the mansion? Or they talk about movies, sporting events, and other distractions. Dave Wesley's players all remained active, whether he was refereeing in front of them or not. Yes, that's chaotic, especially with the number of gamers involved in that first Braunstein game. But I have seen this in action myself. We were in a game of Call of Cthulhu, specifically Cthulhu by Gaslight. Fog-bound Victorian London proved deeply atmospheric. The way we were seated, when the group split up, it was easier to leave the inactive players at the table and to step into the hall for a brief discussion. When we came back in, the supposedly inactive players were so caught up in the atmosphere that they engaged in character banter while we were gone. Now, this was a Braunstein moment, not a failed state in a game, but a sign that players wanted more. Wesley failed to run a structured game. His success lay in recognizing that his players wanted more. Role-playing games now had a blueprint to work off. Many names led to Braunstein. I'm running a Buffy the Vampire Slayer game as I record this video. In honor of Dave Wesley's creation, I named the villain Braunstein. Present at the Braunstein games, Dave Arneson. I don't have time to list the unfeasible number of people named Dave who contributed to D&D. That's Dungeons and Daves. And that is a role-playing fact. From Kriegsspiel by way of Napoleon and Avalon Hill, we reach Dave Wesley, Braunstein, and Dave Arneson. That leads to Dave's setting of Blackmoor. This documentary goes into wargaming and leads you up to Wesley and Arneson hovering at the edge of a new hobby birthed from an old one. You can see around half of this production online. I bought the whole thing. There's a moment involving Arneson that plays out pretty much like any scene in the espionage role-playing game Top Secret. That's apt. Top Secret was published by the D&D people and owed a heavy debt to D&D. The official line, Top Secret is considered the world's first commercially available espionage role-playing game. But Dave Arneson played out spy missions uncommercially, gloriously first. Anyway, Arneson met Gygax, 2 wargamers looking for something. They found each other. Out of wargaming, there were adventure settings. Wesley's Braunstein pointed to Arneson's Blackmoor. Gygax had Greyhawk. If you look at original Dungeons & Dragons, you'll see rules for fantastic medieval wargames campaigns playable with paper and pencil and miniature figures. Yes, the term wargames features prominently. The fantasy role-playing game was so new that it didn't even have an official descriptive title for its own hobby yet. The idea had to crawl out from under the shadowy wings spread by wargaming. In January 1974, the game risked being a craze, a fad, a blip. Through much of 1974, the word spread slowly but surely. In 1975, a fresh wave of people lapped up on the shores of Lake Geneva. I was going to mention a name. It wasn't Gygax or Arneson. The name was Don K. Look at that D&D game. See the logo, published by G&K? Don K was Gary's childhood buddy. They published D&D together. As momentum gathered pace, Don felt the game was going to be big, huge. Yes, it would storm the barriers of popular culture. Don didn't quite live to see it, Gary did. With Don's death, Gary had to buy out the widow's share in the venture. He couldn't afford to, and so he brought other people in to raise the cash so they could buy a seat at the corporate gaming table. Bringing the raw money people in was one of the worst things to happen to the hobby in general, and the D&D company TSR specifically. Don's death led to the buyout. Arneson wasn't around long, though he did pop back for a short time. The raw money people ousted Gary in a coup up at the castle. Bankruptcy loomed. A big company bought D&D, and a bigger company bought that company. This brings me to 50 years of D&D publications. So many times the game could have disappeared. Hard to believe today. And today the game is in the custody of an undead megacorporation. But I should listen to the internet. Hey you, Boaty McBoatface, leave that poor megacorporation alone, damn it. To which I give a rather hearty reply, being about as Scottish as I can be, when I say, and I mean this with all sincerity, fuck off. How to celebrate 50 years of the game that spawned a hobby. Not the way Hasbro did it, for Hasbro didn't do it. They had a 10-year lead-in to announce a 6th edition of the game in an anniversary year, and all with no scandals. They blew it. Instead, they announced 2014 5th edition D&D would be replaced by 2024 5th edition D&D, with the publication spread over 2024 and 2025. If I'd written that as fiction 5 years ago, I'd have received pelters from every corner of the internet, and rightly so. But it's the poor megacorporation that's fending off brickbats today. Aw, bless. Here's how to celebrate the hobby at large and D&D in detail. Roll dice. Have fun. It isn't about the game, the addition of the game, the setting, the rules, the dice. It's about the dice. Whether at a physical table that's beamed around the world to different time zones, or some digital concoction that everyone can interact with, it's about the people you have fun with. You don't need a mega corporation for that. This anniversary book was one I bought believing, yes, very Scottishly at a discount, believing it would be the last Hasbro product I'd get, given that I've purchased so many third-party creator books for D&D. That was my massive pivot away from Hasbro, and it started a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away. I just sensed a disturbance in the force and felt a real passion for gaming, for having fun, dwelt with the third-party people, having a party to which all are invited. The indie people have been celebrating 50 years of D&D products by ignoring corporate bullshit they can't hear over the sound of all the fun that they're having. That and the sound of the dice. You can never have too many dice. That really is a role-playing fact.